Hello world of YouTube and welcome to the Avenged Sevenfold Reformatted Discography review. This was originally going to be my Halloween special. I shelved it because more important things started to take more precedent. But Avenged Sevenfold are a hard rock band from California that I would argue are one of the, definitive examples of bands made for the CD era as far as their sound, how they utilized it, and what they did with album sequencing as a whole. They're a band that I always thought was relatively solid during their 2000s era and has had an interesting evolution throughout the 2010s. And that's mostly because the band is ultimately split into two eras. The pre and post Rev era, where throughout the 2000s when they were making studio albums, the band mostly consisted of M. Shadow's growling vocals, Zacky Vengeance and Sinister Gates' twin guitar solos in classic metal fashion, with Johnny Christ's bass carrying a groove beneath it all, and the Rev being a drummer who was very personality forward. He was one of those drummers that I would argue one can pick out of a lineup sound-wise. And in the interim, they had a couple people step into sticks. Mike Portnoy jumped in for an album, Aaron Ilje jumped in for a whole era, and Brooks Wackerman is their current drummer who's been with them for a couple albums at this point. Today I'm going to be ranking all 8 of their records from worst to best and giving you a general roadmap for getting into the band if you would like to get into Avenged Sevenfold. I would argue their discography doesn't have too many bad barriers of entry. They've got a relatively consistent discography on top of it all, with some interesting lows that sort of stick out amongst the general consistency, in my opinion. Give this video a like if you're excited, and let's go ahead and talk about their worst album, which I would argue is easily Say what you want about how gaudy the album I'm going to put above this is, but Life is But a Dream is like this directionless attempt at a sort of more experimentally driven production a la like Mr. Bungle's California, without the pacing of that record, without the focus of that record, while trying to focus on something else entirely. I went really hard back and forth on putting this above that, though, for the sheer idea of letting mediocrity not win, because for how rough this album is at trying to do these, genre pivots and try to, fit them within this Avenged Sevenfold kind of sterility is just something that I still don't think mixes all that well together. The album starts off in a sense that, it sounds like it could be okay. You know, it's got a couple curveballs here and there, like Mattel, and some of the ideas of We Love You, but, the theatricality of Game Over, the arpeggios and grandness and cosmic, and the sort of hard rock stylings of Beautiful Morning still kind of, make those oddities sort of fit within the Avenged Sevenfold album construction, even if I think Nobody is a dog shit song. As the back half really starts to dissolve out there sonically, it feels like there's no grounding point or any point that really ties it together. And it could just be because the band doesn't do anything outside of the most straightforward version of the stiff funkness of Ordinary or the vocoder styles of Easier. They honestly kind of remind me of some of the low ideas on the newest Voids album, but they're at least produced in a way where they sound nice, and even if they don't sound maybe the most cohesively put together or competently approached. I think those ideas sort of what set this at the bottom, even if it does mean that by and large mediocrity wins. It also, I guess, proves that if you are a band that wants to make experimental music and can't necessarily hit the nail on the head on it, maybe do something a little more mediocre, because it might sound a little bit better at the end of the day.
And obviously, I think that if you're getting into the band or you're spinning the band's discography, this is a high morbid point of curiosity. You've got to really want to know what it sounds like when they do weird genre pivots, but not gracefully. And that's not to spit on them as musicians, because they play their craft well, and honestly, I'm sure that if they kept down this road, they would honestly probably make a solid fucking version of this weird melding of their brand of stuff with better genre pivots, or just a full genre pivot style record. I don't know. But, like, this is such a weird place for their discography to leave off at this point, because I don't like this. I'm never gonna spin this again, and I don't think you should ever do so either, because it's not good. But, like, they could maybe at some point do this again.
Even in my Redacted, I talked about there being a couple of tracks on here and throughout this era that I think are solid enough jams, even if they do have some moments that are just downright derivative in the worst ways, like This Means War. There are still a couple of moments, like Coming Home and Doing Time, and even Hail to the King, where they tap into that sort of like bridging of their sound, or where they were evolving their sound and their inspiration, that I think meet it in a decent enough middle ground. It's just a more watered down version of their clean ass, heavy metal ass sound that I think also sets it back a little bit, in my opinion. It's a record that I like my Redacted of more than this, but even then, I don't spin it in the same nostalgic way, because this was the first album of theirs where I listened and I was not into what they had going on. I really hated a lot of the creative ideas on here, but I still don't ever pin that on Aaron L.J. Even if this is the only album he has ever done with the band, I think that the band was really making some not great ideas on their first full creative excursion without the Rev's guiding touch, and it definitely shows in some ideas, in some instances, in not some great ways.
Ultimately, I think that this album fails in the opposite way in some instances that Life is But a Dream fails, but I think that it's a bit more approachable, which is part of the reason why I put it at this point in the ranking. It's not an album that I think most people should really look for when spinning the band, because it doesn't, I feel like, represent the band's sound. I even feel like the parts that sound more like Avenged Sevenfold on Life is But a Dream sound more like what the band typically has going on. But if you're a fan of, like, early 90s metal music, and you want, like, a 2010s version of that, Hail to the King's a place to go. I don't even know if it's the best place to go, but I've always been a hater of this record, and I still am a hater to this record as I make this review. So that's why it's here.
Now, the space between the bottom two and Sounding the Seventh Trumpet is a pretty sizable chasm. Sounding the Seventh Trumpet is mostly here because the band, from this point, outside of what's below it, has improved upon this foundation in a multitude of fashions. While they did have a relatively large stylistic pivot following the record after this, there are still parts of this that plant seeds to where they would branch out in terms of, like, harnessing vision and scope. They're still trying to reach the rafters on this debut. They're just set back because it's a debut, so it's a little rougher around the edges, and the band feels like they're trying to find their footing. And not necessarily a bad way, because the band, by and large, still has some talent shown here that would also just improve from this point forward. You know, while a lot of it are your more metalcore-inspired stuff, because this and their sophomore outing were more like leaning into some of the rise of metalcore that was happening in the metal scene, especially vocally with M Shadows. Admittedly, I don't think well-executed gravelly vocals, at least especially on this album. I think the style shift he had in particular has benefited them the best post their beginnings. But there's still a handful of cuts on here that I think are pretty damn solid. Like, I like Darkness Surrounding. The drums on that song are pretty fucking choice, and I think that there's a whole stretch of that record with The Art of Subconscious Illusion, even through Lips of Deceit, that I think are just straight-laced, well-executed, heavy jams. I think that, like, their attempts at branching out, like, on Warmness of the Soul, I think are some of the weaker moments, but they at least plant seeds for some styles that they had interest in doing that they would just double and triple down on the further their career just happened to go along. They also have some more bass-led tracks like Streets and An Epic of Time Wasted that I think help carry that back half with some great use of heaviness, both kinetic and stomping. By the by, this is a solid start for these guys. And outside of still thinking it could use a remaster, something I talked about in a video a couple of years ago, I think the reason why I ended up putting it here in the ranking is because it's a place that one could go to out of morbid curiosity. I think at the end of the day, it's more of a cherry-picking experience for me personally. There's a handful of cuts on here that I like going back to, but by and large, if I'm spinning them at all, I'm not going to sounding the Seventh Trumpet in full, to be honest.
Can't you see we're tripping on the wire? Walking through the Candyland of our...
Their 2016 album, The Stage, is honestly something of a similar ilk. It is an album that sees the band reintroducing themselves. They are taking a step forward back into the world with a new drummer, a new vision for what they want to be. And I feel like it is a better attempt at creating something in the spirit of what this band was cooking in their golden era as it stands so far in their career, but with a different creative energy as a whole that I think makes this album, on the other side, pretty damn solid. Clearly, it is not amongst my favorites of favorites. I also, similarly to Sounding the Seventh Trumpet, do not respin it in full unless it is for purpose, like a video. But I think there are more than a wealth of ideas on here that end up pretty alright at the end of the day. I think it ultimately just ends up at this point in the ranking because it is the most alright version of the band at this point in their career. You know, it's got a lot of the ideas and sonics that I, would come to the band for, like throughout the stage setting opener title track of The Stage, or the whirlwind drumming throughout Sunny Disposition and Creating God, that I think do a great job at presenting Brooks Walkerman's brand of drumming and how it still sits in the spirit of this band. Paradigm has this real stomp to it that feels like it's almost trying to blend the worlds that they were doing throughout the 2010s with that, traditional style of theirs. Or even the penultimate track, Fermi Paradox, which feels like it's building to this ultimate climax with the kineticism and throttling that I would expect from the band from a sequencing perspective. It's more the moments like Simulation or Goddamn or even Paradigm to some degree where they fumble the bag when it comes to, like, pulling the song together as a whole. They don't necessarily feel obtuse within the track listing. They just have components that set it back to me personally and more put this album in the middle as far as my opinions on it as a collective piece within the band's discography go. Comparatively to where they followed it up, I kind of wish they would have just kind of kept in this lane at the end of the day. But I enjoy, especially given how there's at least a concept here that I think is articulated well enough while the band tries to sort of find themselves again. And I think on the other side, they had a version of themselves that I was pretty into, to some degree.
I had listened to it when it came out, and I had it on that year's listening log, which I wasn't doing video versions of just yet. And I gave it a 6 then. I'd still honestly give it a 6 now. I think that for some, it's for fans of City of Evil that are like still super into the band. It's a cherry-picking experience for me just because I think its lows set it back, but not as far back as some of the other lows in their career.
I think that if you like some of their, 2000s work like City of Evil or even Nightmare and their self-titled stuff, you'll like components of this. And I think that as far as like evolving the band, it's solid enough, if not a bit too safe in some choice instances.
Come back to me, it's almost easy.
Every time I've sat down to re-listen to Avenged Sevenfold's discography, I always think I'm not gonna like this album as much as I used to. When I did the Patreon version, I thought that. When I sat down originally to do it before the wedding, and even now, I'm like, I really don't like this album. Because its lows stick out like such sore thumbs, but when this album is good, it is some peak shit, my guy. You know, the band's tapping into some choice influences on here and doing some solid stuff with it, like on the obviously Pantera-inspired opener, Critical Acclaim. You know, tracks like Almost Easy and Afterlife are colossal singles for the band that see them evolving some of the ideas from City of Evil into something bigger, and I always feel like I don't really love those songs, and then I remember I'm a millennial. On top of that, Scream and A Little Piece of Heaven have these darker ideas both in the heavy and theatrical that I think are executed pretty damn well. A Little Piece of Heaven in particular is the best part of the back end of this album that I would argue is one of the best definitions of a little bit front-loaded. That is to say, after Afterlife, the back end goes into two stretches. A three-piece of solid jams, and a sandwich of shit with a golden nugget sandwiched between both. I think that Gunslinger, Unbound, and Brompton Cocktail are, like, decent ideas of what the band was cooking during this era. They're, like, album cut-ass songs through and through, but they're fine. You know, Gunslinger being this song for the vets from a band like them makes a lot of sense. And I think that Unbound is the definition of like an album cut-ass jam before the odd but still solid pivot of Brompton Cocktail with its bass-led, you know, string-accompanied atmosphere. You know, it feels like a warm-up for something like A Little Piece of Heaven, but unfortunately, Lost has to happen before that, and while, like, maybe sonically fitting in the wheelhouse of the band, there's just some parts of it that I think set it back so far. Like the auto-tune, probably the worst thing to happen during this era. And I know that may sound a bit hyperbolic, but the song itself isn't anything special outside of that. And it feels like the most late 2000s thing this band could have done in the worst way. I also just think Dear God is not one of their best ballads, a component of the band's songwriting that, admittedly, again, it's just not one of my favorite things the band normally does. And the ballads on this album, by and large, I don't think are the most dazzling at the end of the day. I still don't hate this, though. It is very much for fans of City of Evil. It is the, like, it is the idea. It is the band during a high, riding that high pretty well, in my opinion. It's a decent stepping stone that I think, unfortunately, sends the Rev off well, because it was his last album with the band, but it is not the last album with his hand in the mix, because
Get to me, yes, create me, control you. I left myself for it on you, I stop.
it is so unfortunate that the Rev passed. The Rev's spirit is felt because the drums he had written for this were still used on top of having these songs about grief and moving on being the core lyrical themes of this. Mike Portnoy lended his talents to playing those drums on here, and I think he does a great job. I think that Mike Portnoy is a fantastic drummer, and then that goes without saying. This is actually the tour that I saw them on. This is the only time I've ever seen Avenged Sevenfold, and honestly, if I were to ever see them in their current state, I'm glad that I saw them on that tour. Not just because I love this album this much, but I think that as far as, like, the band unified, I don't think that they've sounded this good since. I think that as far as having heart, a lot of this record is felt. You know, while you still have the dark theatrics that this band is known for, they are lent to the lingering darkness and death that permeate throughout the lyrics on this. I really enjoy the heavy moments like Nightmare and Danger Line and God Hates Us, which feels like a true just moment of purging anger that I think hits the page well. some of the more tangential moments on top of that, like Natural Born Killer and Welcome to the Family, add to the darkness and heaviness in a way that I think fits the mood, even if they are sort of deviations of a sort. But on top of that, the ballads on here are easily some of the best the band has ever written. I mean, you got Buried Alive, you got So Far Away, and Tonight the World Dies, all sort of elevating those themes of missing somebody or being, you know, torn apart, torn asunder inside. And I think help weave those, you know, emotional cores strongly and unify the album on the other side. Now, that is to say, this album is great, but it's still not the best the band has ever done. And that is all to say I enjoy a lot of what this album has going on. I love how sonically the band just juggles these ideas into a solid sequencing on top of that. You know, I enjoy this record a lot. I think that if you enjoy... If you're sold on the concept of Avenged Sevenfold and you haven't spun Nightmare, you really should. There's a lot of good ideas permeating throughout this. I think the use of grand theatrics helps to service those themes as well. If you like City of Evil or the 2000s era, obviously I think you should spin this. If not, start here. I don't know, I feel like it's one of the most essential pieces of the band's career because it is the band at a critical pivot point in their career and sending that old era off in grand splendor here with just some absolute heat. Talk about taking your roots and growing from them. Waking the Fallen is the antithesis of a sophomore slump as far as creating a great showcasing of unifying under this umbrella of making your sound bolder. Aces. You know, while I don't miss this metalcore era of the band, I think it's partially because they peaked here with it, man. I'm glad that they decided to do other things, because there's just a lot of good shit here that I don't really care to think about a universe where they just kept doing this shit. I mean, the runs throughout Chapter 4 or Heartbeat or Reminiscence are just some razor-sharp, heavy shit. You know, I'm glad that M. Shadows' voice evolved a bit throughout here. You know, he's got some good... You know, he's got a good presence on this record in a way that I think he wasn't always there on Sounding the Seventh Trumpet. I think production-wise, they just sound a lot better on here as well. Obviously, Unholy Confessions is a classic in the band's catalog. Even where they tried to, like, branch out their horizons even further from the moments they did on Sounding the Seventh Trumpet, like on the I Won't See You Tonight two-part suite, create this good juxtaposition of, honestly, their future and their now to some degree, given where their sounds did split off from here. It's just this great nugget in the band's discography that I think is probably the best starting point. If you want, like, a place to go when getting into Avenged Sevenfold, make it Waking the Fallen, and then just kind of go out from there in their discography at your leisure. I wish that they followed the stage with something like this with their current drummer.
And I mean that in the sense of, like, taking the components of the stage that, like, felt fresh and then, like, branching off from there. Because that's one of the things that I think is really captivating about this, because it doesn't entirely sound like City of Evil, and that more is because of a byproduct of, like, making this as the band that they were, I guess. But, like, I really do enjoy how very 2000s metalcore it all really sounds, outside of the pockets that I talked about kind of splitting off. But, like, it's got some good heavy shit with some great riff work. Like, I know I've mostly talked about, like, the Rev's drumming, and I would argue the Rev's drumming gets a lot of love on... It's, like, the best part of Sounding the Seventh Trumpet outside of the guitars. But, like, Johnny and Sinister's guitars sound really fucking good on this album in particular. They have some great just kinetic riff work. Their soloing that's here is still really cool, and it's interesting to see them, like, become this middle child of their beginnings and where they would go, and having it be so damn good. Like, so damn good.
Life is But a Dream just ain't it. This is, though, absolute classic in my opinions. I fucking love this album. It was not my starting point, but it was one that I got shortly after getting into the band and immediately fell in love with. this and Waking the Fallen are the only two albums I own from this band on CD still, and it's because, like, as far as taking some of those burgeonings that they were planting better seeds on in Waking the Fallen and sprouting them out into something genuinely worthwhile, City of Evil is, honestly, in my opinion, like, a classic of its era, in its genre. It is, like, the perfect stepping stone in the evolution of hard rock as a genre. It has this clean-ass production. You know, I've griped in pockets about sounding too pristine or sounding way too glossy, but it's because, like, records like this do that sound not at the sacrifice of timbre or musicality or just anything to lend personality to the respective instruments that are being produced. The twin guitar stuff still sounds razor sharp. That bass still rumbles under the beat. The Rev's drums on here are fucking great. You know, you've got the classic songs from the band's catalog like Beast and the Harlot or Bat Country. You've even got, you know, ballads done in a glossy but huge hook-driven sense like Seize the Day and Strength of the World, which act as these, like, Metallica-inspired hard rock anthems with these balance of, like, heavy and soft. You've got the heavy album. You've got the album cut-ass ragers like Burn It Down or Blinded in Chains or Trashed and Scattered. I like how throughout the back end they spread their wings farther but still have these moments where they just get nice and heavy, like on Betrayed or on Sidewinder. I think that as far as pacing a record of their style, I think that this is just a great example of it done well. I really like this album. You know, I know that I've got, like, mass nostalgia for it. It is one of the few albums of theirs I will spin in full whenever I'm getting nostalgic for this band and their sound, but, like, this shit sounds great. This shit is awesome as far as, like, as a fan of old school metal, seeing it done in a modern sense. I think that if you're not starting with Waking the Fallen, you should start with City of Evil. It was my starting point, and I think that it's a pretty solid starting point. It's got a bit further into the transition into their more hard rock driven stuff, and, you know, it loses even more of that, like, metalcore style of metal and more goes like traditional metal. But I think that they do traditional metal pretty good in a lot of their records, even in some of their lows that I've criticized throughout this video. But I like City of Evil. I think that it is a gem. I think it is absolutely the best Avenged Sevenfold album. And those are my thoughts on the discography. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you'd like to give it a like, if you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week depending on what I've got going on. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Advarak. You guys have good days, lots of situations, and I'll see you another day.